The night Luke Monroe found her, the wolves were already circling. He heard them first, that low, patient snarling that meant a pack had cornered something they believed was already dead, and he almost kept riding. The Blackthorn Pass was no place to linger after dark, not with the temperature dropping so fast that his breath came out in thick plumes, and the frost had already begun to stiffen the canvas rolls strapped to his saddle. He was 2 days out from Ridgefort, alone on the high trail with nothing but his horse, his rifle, a week's worth of dried provisions, and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that made a man want to put his head down and let the world sort itself out without him. But the wolves snarled again, and then he heard something else beneath that sound, a sharp, defiant hiss, something almost human but rougher, and the crash of a branch being swung hard against stone or tree. Luke Monroe was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from a decade of honest work, with calloused hands and a quiet face that most people read as impassive until they looked at his eyes, which were a warm and thoughtful brown that had a way of seeing things clearly. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he was also not a man who could ride past something that was still fighting to live. He wheeled his horse off the trail and pushed through the tree line. The scene he found in the small clearing was one he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. A fire had been built there, a proper one, the kind that someone with real wilderness sense had laid, 2 large rocks angled to block the wind, a bed of coals that would hold heat, green wood stacked to the side to prevent fast burning. But the fire had been scattered. Boots had kicked through it, or perhaps a fight had, because the coals were strewn across the frozen ground and most of the light was gone, leaving only a few embers guttering against the pine needles. Beside those embers, with her back pressed against a granite outcrop and a thick branch held in both hands like a club, was an orc woman. She was tall even in her crouch, maybe a finger's breadth under 6 feet when standing, and built with the lean, powerful lines of someone who had spent their life working hard and eating harder. She wore a fitted leather bodice over a lace front blouse the color of dark rust, the bodice cinched tight at her waist with a buckled strap and reinforced at the shoulders with small riveted plates. Her leggings were dark oiled hide, tucked into knee-high boots with worn soles and a throwing knife sheathed at the right calf. The blouse's laces were half undone at the collar, and there was a long cut across her upper left arm, dark with blood that had already begun to crust in the cold, and another bruise rising along her jaw that was darkening from red to purple even as Luke watched. Her hair was black and thick, worn loose in a way that suggested it had been bound before, and the binding had been lost or torn, and it fell in heavy waves around a face that was striking in the way that certain wild landscapes were striking, dramatic and strong, with prominent cheekbones, a broad nose, and the elongated lower tusks that every orc carried, her small and elegantly curved, ivory pale against her dark green skin. Her eyes, when they snapped to him, were a deep amber gold, and they held in them all the heat of the embers still glowing at her feet. She did not lower the branch. 3 wolves stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with the calculating patience of hunters who knew they had time. A 4th was down, lying still. She had already killed one. Luke did not hesitate. He raised his rifle, fired once in the air, then swept the barrel toward the nearest wolf and held it there. The sound cracked through the cold night like a hammer on an anvil, and all 3 remaining wolves broke. They spun and bolted into the dark with the suddenness of smoke clearing in a doorway. Silence settled. Luke lowered the rifle and looked at the woman against the rock. She was still holding the branch. Her eyes had not left him. "Easy," he said, and kept his voice low and even the way he spoke to a spooked horse. "I am not going to hurt you." Her jaw tightened. "I did not ask for your help." Her voice was deep and measured, with the faint rolling accent of the clans from the eastern passes. Her common was good, better than good, actually, clear and precise in the way that people who learned a language as adults often spoke it, without the shortcuts that native speakers took for granted. "I know," Luke said. He did not move from where he sat on horseback, giving her the space. But those wolves would have come back and you are bleeding. That is not a conversation you want to have with a wolf pack. She looked at the cut on her arm as though she had forgotten it was there. Then she looked at the scattered fire, and he saw something flicker across her face, exhaustion, maybe, or the particular despair of someone who has been fighting very hard for a very long time and has just watched the last of their safety get kicked apart. She lowered the branch. "My fire was destroyed," she said. She said it simply, without complaint, just as a statement of fact, but there was something underneath it that caught at Luke's chest. "I know," he said again. He swung down from the horse and tied the reins loosely to a branch, then crouched and began gathering the scattered pieces of the fire. The rocks first, repositioning them, then the larger coal pieces still holding heat, coaxing them together with the careful breath and quick movements of someone who had built 1,000 fires. He pulled dry tinder from the oilskin pouch at his belt, added it to the coals, and had the fire breathing again inside of 2 minutes. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She had watched all of this without moving, the branch still loosely in one hand, her amber eyes tracking everything he did with an expression that was caught somewhere between suspicion and something softer. "I am Luke Monroe," he said. "I am a trapper heading south toward Ridgefort. I have enough fire for 2. A very long pause. "Shagrol," she said at last. "Shagrol Strongtusk. Are you hurt anywhere else, Shagrol, beyond the arm?" She considered the question seriously, the way someone does when they are taking stock of a body that has been through an ordeal. "My ribs, 1 or 2 may be cracked, and my ankle is turned, not broken." She paused. "They came in the night. A group of men from the Ridgefort militia. They called it a patrol, but there was no warrant, no cause given. They scattered my fire and took my pack and my horse." She said it all with a flat, factual calm that was more devastating than anger would have been. "They said a lone orc in the pass was a threat to the settlement. They were very thorough." Luke felt something dark and familiar move through him. He had known men like that. He had grown up in a settlement where boys were taught before they could properly read that orcs were the enemy, that they were dangerous, that the stories of the border wars were the only stories worth knowing. Some men never got past those lessons. "How long ago?" he asked. 3 hours, perhaps 4. "Then they are long gone." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his pack. He had a wool blanket, a rolled fur medical wrapping, a small pot, dried meat, 2 hard biscuits, and a paper-wrapped portion of dried berries. He laid them out beside the fire with the methodical care of someone who was genuinely trying to show that there was no trap here, no angle. "Let me see your arm," he said. Another pause. She was measuring him, he understood. Everything about her posture said she was calculating the risk of letting someone close, and he did not rush her. He simply waited, his hands open and still. She came forward and sat across from him at the fire, tucking her bad ankle beneath her carefully. She extended her left arm. The cut was long but not deep. It would not need stitching, but it needed to be cleaned and wrapped before the cold turned it troublesome. Luke worked quietly and with care, dampening a strip of clean cloth from his pack with water from his canteen, cleaning the wound gently, pressing a folded pad of cloth over it, and wrapping it with the linen bandage he always carried because the mountain trails were unkind to the body. She did not flinch once, not at the cleaning, not at the pressure, not when he tied the bandage off with a firm knot. When he was done, he became aware that she was watching his face rather than his hands. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It was not quite a question. Should I be? Most men from Ridgefort would say yes. Luke poured water into the small pot and set it at the fire's edge to heat. "I am not most men from Ridgefort," he said. "Here." He handed her the dried meat and one of the biscuits. "Eat. You have been bleeding and you have been cold. Your body needs fuel." She took the food. She ate with real hunger but controlled it, another thing he noticed about her, the way she seemed to manage herself with an iron self-discipline, never letting even the most basic vulnerability show more than she could help. "What were you doing in the pass?" he asked, not with suspicion, just because he wanted to understand. She was quiet for a moment, then, "I was going home, or what is left of it." She broke off a piece of biscuit and chewed it. "My clan's camp was broken up by a militia incursion 6 months ago. I was trading at Harrowmere when it happened. I came back to find the camp burned. Some of my people scattered north into the high ranges. I have been tracking them since spring." She paused. "I found them, finally. They are in the valleys beyond the northern pass. I was heading back through Blackthorn to gather the last of my things from a cache I kept near Ridgefort. Now I have no horse and no pack." The water had begun to steam. Luke wrapped his hands in cloth and pulled the pot from the heat, adding the dried berries and a pinch of something from a small tin wild ginger root, dried and ground, and handed her the pot to warm her hands around first before she drank. She looked at it, then at him. "I do not understand you," she said. "I am just a man sitting by a fire," he said simply. Something shifted in her face. Something small and careful and important. They sat at the fire for a long time after that, letting the warmth work through them both. Luke told her about the trapping lines he ran along the southern slopes, the cabin he kept at the edge of the high meadow, 3 days' ride north of Ridgefort. She told him about the eastern valleys, the way the light came through the aspen groves in the early morning, the trade route her clan had used for generations before the border wars closed it. They spoke carefully, the way people do when they are newly in the presence of someone they are not sure of yet, but are beginning to want to know better. At some point the fire died down to comfortable coals and the cold deepened, and Luke spread the fur blanket on the ground and rolled himself in his wool blanket on the far side of the fire. He set his pocket watch, a battered brass thing his father had given him, wound with a small key on the flat rock between them. "I will take first watch," he said. 4 hours, then I will wake you." She looked at the watch. Then she looked at him. "I am trained for watch duty. You do not need to lose sleep." "Your ribs are cracked and your ankle is turned," he said gently. "Let your body start the work of healing. I will take first watch." She lay down on the fur he had unrolled for her. She had not brought it over herself. He had simply put it in her space and stepped back, and she had eventually lowered herself onto it, and she was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere above. "Luke Monroe," she said. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly. "Because you were cold and bleeding and alone, and I had fire and bandages," he said. "There is not much more calculation to it than that." A silence. Then very quietly, "Thank you." He kept watch until the small hours, and when 4 hours had passed by the brass watch, he crossed to where she was lying and crouched beside her. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently, just the lightest contact, to wake her rather than startle her. Her eyes opened immediately, fully aware, the amber gaze sharp and present. "Your watch," he said, and held out the brass timepiece to her. She sat up and took it from his hand, and their fingers touched briefly in the exchange. A moment so small it should have meant nothing, but Luke felt it like a struck chord. She offered him half her watch without hesitation, he realized. She had been awake already, he could tell. She had been watching him watch, making sure he did not move toward her while she lay vulnerable. But when he held out the watch, she took it and took the responsibility of it, and when his 4 hours were done, she came to crouch beside him and touched his shoulder with the same careful deliberateness he had used with her. "Your turn," she said softly, and set the watch on the rock beside him. He slept, and he trusted that she was watching, and that trust was not a small thing. In the morning, gray and cold and shot through with the first pale light, she had rebuilt the fire and boiled water and found, from somewhere, her calf sheath, he realized. She had a small secondary kit tucked behind the throwing knife, a portion of pressed grain cake that she split exactly in half and handed to him without comment when he stirred. He sat up and looked at her across the renewed fire. In the early morning light, with the dark bruise across her jaw and the careful steadiness of her amber eyes, she was one of the most striking people he had ever seen. "I need to get to Ridgefort," she said. "I have business at the trading post that cannot wait." "I am heading south," he said. "You can ride with me." He glanced at her ankle, which she was keeping carefully off the ground. "The horse can carry double." The look she gave him was measuring and slow. "You are heading to Ridgefort with an orc woman on your horse." "I am heading to Ridgefort with a person who needs a ride," he said. The people who have a problem with that are their own problem. She stood, tested her ankle, and nodded once, briskly, the way someone does when they have decided something and intend to act on it without further ceremony. They were on the trail by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She sat behind him on the horse and held onto the back of his saddlebag at first, careful not to touch him more than necessary. By the time the trail widened and dropped into the lower forest, she had shifted forward slightly and her hands rested on either side of his waist, light and controlled but present, and the warmth of her was something he was very aware of. They talked as they rode, because the trail was long and the morning was quiet, and something about motion seemed to make words easier. She told him about the trade she was trying to complete. She had left a cache of winter furs at a contact storehouse in Ridgefort 6 months ago, before everything had gone wrong, and she needed to collect the payment for them so she could bring real supplies back to her clan in the northern valleys. Blankets, salt, medicines, seed corn. The things people needed to survive a winter in the high country. He told her about the last of his trap lines, the ones he had not run in 2 seasons because the trails had gotten dangerous. He told her about his cabin in the high meadow, a log structure he had built himself over 3 summers, solid and warm, with a good stone fireplace and a loft and a root cellar. He told her about the way the elk came through the meadow in the early morning in autumn, when the air was so cold and clear that you could see them from 300 yards through the gold-turning grass. She listened the way some people do, with her whole attention, and when she asked questions they were specific and interested rather than polite, the kind of questions that told you the other person was actually thinking about what you had said rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. "You built the cabin yourself?" she asked. "Over 3 summers, yes. The first summer was just the walls, the second summer I got the roof on properly, the third summer I laid the stone fireplace and dug the root cellar." "That is real work," she said. There was respect in her voice. "It is," he agreed, "but it is good work, the kind that stays." She was quiet for a moment. "My clan builds differently. We build together all at once, many hands. Our shelters go up in a day." "Different ways to get to the same place," he said. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose so." They arrived at the southern edge of Ridgefort's outer lots by midday, and the trouble started before they had cleared the gatepost. A man named Curran Bolt, who served as the deputy constable and ran the militia patrols on the Blackthorn side, spotted them from his post outside the grain warehouse. He was a thick-necked, small-eyed man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, and the look of someone who had decided long ago that his authority was a substitute for his conscience. "Monroe," he said, stepping out into the road so that the horse had to stop, his eyes fixed on Shagrol. "What in hell do you think you are doing riding that into town?" Luke felt Shagrol stiffen behind him. He kept his own voice very steady. "Good afternoon, Deputy Bolt. I am bringing a trading partner into town to complete a legal business transaction. If you have an issue with that, I suggest you look up the Ridgefort Trading Charter, which permits orc traders entry during posted market hours." Bolt's face went red. A small crowd had begun to accumulate, the kind of crowd that gathers at anything that might become a spectacle, men and women coming out of the feed store doorway, a couple of farmhands stopping their wagon at the edge of the road, a woman drawing her children behind her skirts. Shagrol's hands tightened slightly at Luke's waist. "She rides in that saddle behind you like a wife," Bolt said, his voice rising for the crowd. "You gone orc soft, Monroe. You know what her kind do to settlements when they get comfortable enough to—" "Her name," Luke said clearly, and loudly enough that the crowd could hear every word, "is Shagrol Strongtusk. She is a registered trader with a legitimate cash claim at Hendrick's storehouse. She has done nothing illegal. She is on a public road during market hours, and she is under my escort." He paused one deliberate beat. "And if your patrol stripped her supplies and horse in the Blackthorn last night without a warrant, Deputy, that is something the trading magistrate is going to find very interesting." The crowd had gone very quiet. Bolt's jaw worked. He looked from Luke to Shagrol and back again. Luke held his gaze with the patient, unmovable steadiness of a man who has nothing to be afraid of and knows it. Bolt stepped aside. Luke rode into town with Shagrol behind him and did not look back. He could feel her breath slow behind him, and feel the deliberate way she released the tension in her hands at his waist. "That was boldly done," she said quietly, close to his ear. "It was the truth," he said. Truth is usually bold enough on its own. The business at Hendrick's storehouse took less than an hour. Old Farrell Hendricks, who had been trading with orc clans for 40 years and had made a steady living from it, greeted Shagrol with a handshake and brought out his ledger without dramatics. The cash had been properly stored and accounted for 16 winter fox pelts, 8 beaver, 4 bear, and the sum owed was paid out in good coin, and 2 promissory notes accepted at the main trading posts in the northern passes. When they stepped back out onto the storehouse porch, Shagrol turned to Luke with the coins and the notes folded carefully in a leather wallet tucked into her bodice, and she looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I owe you a debt," she said. "You do not," he said. "We were going the same direction." "We were not going the same direction. You came down the Blackthorn. Ridgefort is at the end of the Blackthorn. I was heading away from Ridgefort when your militia caught me." She paused. "You rode 2 hours south out of your way." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the afternoon sun was coming at a low angle that put light across her face, that striking, strong face with the amber eyes and the curve of her tusks, and he thought that he could not remember the last time he had been quite this awake to another person's presence. "All right," he said. "Then let me suggest a way you can settle the debt if it matters to you." "It matters to me. I still have 3 days of provisions. My cabin is north of here, not south. But it is a full day's ride from the edge of town, and it sits exactly at the crossroads of the 2 trails that lead into the northern valleys." He looked at her ankle, which she was still favoring. "If you ride with me to the cabin, you can rest a day, restock properly from my stores, and leave for the north without spending another night in the open on a bad ankle. That is the debt." She was quiet. He had the sense that she was genuinely weighing it, not performing the weighing, actually calculating the risk versus the need. "One day," she said. "One day," he agreed. They bought what they needed from the market stalls, additional salt, wrapped medicines from the herbalist, 2 good wool blankets, and were back on the north road before the afternoon had given way to evening. The ride to the cabin was quiet in the way that comfortable things are quiet. The trail wound up through spruce and birch, the trees thickening as they climbed, the air sharpening with the smell of pine resin and the coming cold. Shagrol rode behind him easily now, her hands settled against his waist with a naturalness that had replaced the careful not-touching of the morning, and they talked sometimes and were silent sometimes, and both of the silences and the talking felt easy. She asked him what had made him a trapper rather than a farmer. He told her about coming west at 19, with nothing but his father's old pack and the old man's brass pocket watch, and learning the mountains the hard way over 2 years before he understood them well enough to run reliable lines. She asked about his family, and he told her simply that his mother had passed when he was 12 and his father the following year, and that he had 2 older brothers who had stayed east to farm the family plot, and that he wrote them letters he was not sure ever arrived. She told him that her family, her mother, a sister, and a cousin who was like a brother, were in the northern valleys with the rest of the clan, and that the 6 months of separation had been the longest of her life, and that every morning she woke up and thought about getting back to them was a morning she moved a little faster. "What is your sister's name?" he asked. "Braca," she said. "She is 23. She thinks she knows everything." "Does she?" A pause, and then the deep, surprised laugh that he had not heard from her before, warm and genuine and full, the kind of laugh that rolls right out of a person without their permission. "Almost," she admitted. "Almost everything. She is very clever." He smiled, and she couldn't see it from behind him, but he suspected she could hear it in his voice when he said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." The cabin, when they reached it, was exactly what he had described: solid, honest work, a long, low-roof structure of notched spruce logs with a stone chimney at the north end and a covered porch across the front. The root cellar door was set into the hillside behind it, and a small barn, more of a lean-to really, stood 30 yards to the east where his trapping gear and spare equipment lived. There was a well, and a stack of split wood under a canvas cover, and the general look of a place that was actively cared for. Shagrol looked at it from the saddle as they came down the trail into the meadow. "You built this," she said. "I did." "It is a good building," she said, and the respect in her voice was the same honest, specific quality that had been there when she said it on the trail, and he felt it the same way, like a thing worth having. He put the horse in the lean-to and got the fire going and made a proper meal for the first time in days, dried elk sausage with onion and salt, biscuits cooked in the cast iron pan, the dried berries stewed with a bit of hard cider from the clay jug he kept in the root cellar. Shagrol did not offer to help, and he did not ask her to. She sat at the table with her bad ankle extended and watched him work, and there was something in the quality of her watching that he felt along his skin. After they ate, she said she would take first watch, and he said there was no need. The meadow was quiet and well chosen. No road came directly to the cabin, and the horse would wake them for trouble before any human watch would notice it. "Old habit," she said. "Earn the habit differently here," he said gently. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. She slept in the loft, which he had made up with the thickest of his spare furs and a proper pillow stuffed with dried grass and wool, and he slept below at the fire as he usually did when the nights ran cold. Sometime in the deep of the night he heard her come down the ladder, and he lay still and listened, and there was the soft sound of her sitting in the chair by the fire, very quietly. He turned his head. She was sitting upright, her knees drawn slightly up, the amber eyes catching the firelight. She had not woken him, she was simply sitting. "You should sleep," he said softly. "I know," she said, and did not move. He sat up, pushed back his blanket, and got up and built the fire a little higher, and they sat together in the firelight without speaking for a good while. At some point he realized she had fallen asleep in the chair, chin tipped forward, her breath slow and even. He did not move her. He sat across from her and let her sleep and watched the fire and thought about things he had not thought about in a long time, about loneliness, and about the strange luck of a clear, cold night on the Blackthorn Pass. In the morning she was up before him, and she had boiled water for tea using the dried herb bundle she had bought from the herbalist in Ridgefort, and she set a cup on the table beside him when he woke. He sat up and looked at her. She stood with her back to him at the window, looking out at the meadow in the early light, and she was so vivid and real in his small cabin, her black hair loose down her back, the fitted leather bodice, the oiled hide leggings, one hand resting on the sill, that the sight of her hit him somewhere deep and certain, the way true things sometimes do. "You could stay," he said, and then stopped, because it had come out before he had thought it through, and he was aware that it might land the wrong way. She turned from the window, her expression was careful. "I have to get back to my clan," she said. "I know. I am not suggesting otherwise." He picked up the tea and took a careful breath. "I am saying that if you needed a place to come back to after you have brought them the supplies after the winter, if you wanted somewhere to stay that was not the open trail. The cabin is here, the offer stands." A long silence. She looked at him, really looked, in the way she had the night on the pass when she was measuring the risk of something. But this time the thing she was measuring was different. "Why?" she asked, and he was honest with her because she had been honest with him. "Because I have been alone on this mountain for 4 years and I have not minded it until now," he said, "and I am not entirely sure what to do with that." She was quiet for a very long time. The morning light moved across the cabin floor. A bird called somewhere outside in the spruce. "I will think about it," she said finally. He nodded. "That is enough." She left that morning, resupplied and rested, her bad ankle wrapped tightly in fresh linen. The new blankets rolled across the pack saddle of the horse he had loaned her, an older mare, gray-muzzled and steady, good for mountain trails and not prone to panic. He stood on the porch and watched her go, and she looked back once at the edge of the meadow, a long amber look, and then the spruce trees took her. The cabin was very quiet. He spent the next 2 weeks running his trap lines with a discipline that was partly habit and partly an attempt to fill every hour with something useful. He caught well, the season was good, the upper slopes busy with beaver and marten, and he cured the pelts properly and stacked them in the lean-to and told himself he was simply working, which was what he had always done. He was a man alone on a mountain. It was not new. But in the evenings, when he sat at the fire with the brass watch open on the table and the sound of the wind in the spruce outside, he thought about amber eyes and a deep laugh that had rolled out without warning and hands that settled against his waist, with the steadiness of something that had decided, quietly, to trust him. He thought about her going back to the Blackthorn on a gray horse, and about the northern valleys he had never seen, and about whether she would think about the cabin the way he was thinking about her face. He thought she probably would not. She had her people to get back to. She had real things to do. He was a man with a cabin and a trap line and a brass watch, and she was something altogether more remarkable, and it was foolish to sit at a fire and feel this way about a woman who had stayed one night and taken a horse loan and left. He told himself this sensibly and repeatedly. He did not quite believe it. She came back in 6 weeks. He heard the horse on the meadow trail at midday on a Thursday. He knew it was Thursday because he kept the days carefully in a log, the way solitary men on trap lines do, to keep from losing track of time entirely. And he came out of the lean-to with his hands full of beaver pelts and turned, and saw her riding the gray mare across the morning frost grass of the meadow, and the thing that happened in his chest was immediate and physical and undeniable. She pulled up at the porch rail and looked down at him. "I gave your mare back her name," she said by way of greeting. "She told me it was Rue. She is a very opinionated animal." "She is," he agreed. He set down the pelts. "You came back." "I brought supplies to my clan." She swung down from Rue's back. She was moving more easily, her ankle had healed, or nearly so. "My mother sends you a message." He blinked. "Your mother sends me a message. She says, any man who loans a horse to a stranger on the Blackthorn in October is either a fool or a good man, and Braca thinks you are probably both, which in Braca's experience is the best kind." She said it with absolute gravity, and then the deep, warm laugh broke through again at the end of it, and he found himself laughing too, which he had not done in a genuine way in what felt like months. "Come inside," he said. "I will make tea." She stayed 3 days that time. They ran one of his shorter trap lines together on the second day. She moved through the woods with the quiet, efficient grace of someone who had spent years in difficult terrain, and she understood the logic of the line placement without his having to explain it, and she spotted a set he had laid badly and told him so directly and without softness, and he corrected it and was grateful for the honesty. In the evenings they sat at the table and talked about everything about the border wars and what she had heard of them from her grandmother, who had fought in the final campaign and come home changed, about the trading post politics of the Northern Valley settlements, and the slow, difficult work of building commerce across the divide, about what he wanted his trap line to become, which was a proper fur trading operation with a winter team and a pack trail to the valley markets. On the third night, the fire burned low and they were still talking, and she reached across the table and picked up the brass watch and turned it over in her hands. "Tell me about this," she said. "My father's," he said. "He was a clockmaker's apprentice before he came west. He kept the watch his whole life and gave it to me when I was 17. Said it was the only thing he owned that had any real craft in it." She ran her thumb across the case. The firelight caught the brass. She turned it over again and opened the cover and listened to the tick of it, that steady, unfussy heartbeat of a well-made mechanism. "It keeps true time," she said. "Never been wrong by more than 30 seconds in 12 years, he said. She looked at him across the table. The fire was very low, just coals now, and the light was warm and close between them. Her amber eyes held the glow of it. "Luke," she said. "Yes." She put the watch down between them very carefully and left her fingers resting beside it. He put his hand over hers. Just that, nothing more, just his rough calloused hand over her long green fingers, warm and still. She looked at his hand on hers, and then she looked up at him, and the thing in her face was not cautious anymore. It was simply there, open and clear, like the meadow in the early morning when all the mist had burned away. "I would like to come back," she said, "not just to return the horse." "I would like that," he said, "very much." Her fingers turned under his and laced through them. They stayed that way until the coals went dark. She left in the morning and he stood on the porch again, but this time it was different. She had said she would come back after the midwinter, once the pass opened reliably, and she had said it the way someone says a thing they have decided and intend to keep. He believed her. And he worked through the winter with a different quality of purpose than he had before, tending the trap lines, improving the cabin, laying in extra stores, mending the table and making a better chair, and rebuilding the root cellar door so it did not stick in the wet cold. He did not let himself think about it too directly, but he found himself seeing the cabin through other eyes and thinking about what could be made better, what would last, what would matter. In the deep of January, a letter came via the trail courier, a remarkable thing, because the trail courier only made the high meadow run twice a winter at most. The letter was written in a careful, precise hand on rough paper, in common so clean and formal that he could see the concentration it had taken. It said, "The pass has been good. My clan is well provisioned. Braca has decided she likes you without ever meeting you, which is suspicious, and I told her so. The elk in the North Valleys come through in the morning, just as you described. I think you would like it very much here. I think about your cabin in the evenings when the fire is low. I will be there before the first thaw." He folded the letter and put it in the tin box where he kept important things and went out and looked at the stars over the meadow for a long time. She arrived before the first thaw, as she had promised. The snow was still heavy on the spruce when he heard Rue on the trail, and this time when she came across the meadow she was riding with a companion, a younger orc woman with a sharp, bright face and her hair shorn close on the sides, who looked at Luke from horseback with the frank, evaluating stare of someone who has heard a great deal about a person and intends to form her own opinion without delay. "This is Braca," Shagrol said, swinging down. "I suspected," Luke said. Braca leaned down from her horse and looked at him closely. "You loaned her your best horse," she said. "Not a spare animal, a good horse. My sister says you looked at Rue and decided she was the right one. She says you handed her over without hesitation. She needed a reliable horse for the mountain trail," he said simply. Braca leaned back and glanced at Shagrol. "I like him," she said, as though settling a matter. Shagrol's expression was the very specific one of an older sibling being subjected to a younger one's verdict on something personal. "Thank you, Braca," she said, with enormous restraint. Braca stayed 2 days, slept in the loft with cheerful disregard for ceremony, ate everything she could reach, asked Luke approximately 40 questions about trap line economics, told him 3 mortifying stories about Shagrol's adolescence, and left on the morning of the 3rd day with Rue and 2 promissory notes for pelts, saying she would tell their mother that Luke Monroe was acceptable, which she pronounced as though it were high praise. When she was gone and the sound of the horse had faded down the trail, Luke turned to find Shagrol standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that was trying very hard not to be the warm and helpless thing it actually was. "She told the story about the goat, didn't she?" Shagrol said. "She told 2 stories about a goat," Luke said. "I think they may have been different goats." Shagrol put her hand over her face, and then she started to laugh, and he started to laugh, and they were still laughing when they came inside. She stayed a month that time. She ran the trap lines with him as a partner, and she was a better trapper than she had let on. She knew the Eastern methods, the ones that left less sign and set more cleanly and brought in better pelts. She taught him 3 different snare techniques that he had never seen before, and he adopted all of them. He showed her the root cellar system and the way he had rigged the smokehouse, and she improved both without being asked, just saw what could be better and made it better with the same direct, practical intelligence she brought to everything. They worked well together. That was the quiet revelation of that month. Not the obvious things, not the way he was aware of her in every room of the cabin or the particular quality of the evenings by the fire, but the deep, steady pleasure of working alongside someone who matched your pace and brought their own skill to every task and made the whole operation better and larger than it had been before. One afternoon in early March, she was mending a piece of harness at the table and he was cleaning his rifle at the other end, and the cabin was full of pale winter light and the smell of wood smoke and leather oil, and it struck him so clearly and simply that this was what he wanted, not an idea of a thing, not a longing for something unnamed, but this specifically here with her. He set down the rifle cloth. "Shagrol." She looked up. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set down the harness. She looked at him steadily, the amber eyes patient and present. "I know this is not simple," he said. "I know what the town thinks of it, and I know the pass is long, and I know that you have your people and I have mine, and none of it is simple." He paused. "But I am in love with you. I have been for a while now, and I wanted to say it out loud clearly once so you know where I stand." The cabin was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the strange vulnerability of a said thing that has not yet been answered, sitting in the air between two people. Then she rose from the table and crossed to him and put both hands on either side of his face, and she tilted his face up toward hers, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative thing. It was warm and sure and real, the way she was, the way she did everything, with full intention and nothing held back from it once she had decided. He rose from his chair into her, his hands finding her waist, and the kiss lasted a long, deep, suspended moment that felt like the end of a long walk and the beginning of something else entirely. When they drew back, she stayed close, her thumbs resting against his jaw. "I know what the town thinks," she said, her voice quiet and low. "I also know what I think." "What do you think?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I have been building arguments against coming back here for 4 months," she said. And every single one of them was dishonest. She tilted her head slightly, amber eyes on his. "I love you, Luke Monroe. I have loved you since you offered me half your fire on the worst night I had had in a year. I simply needed time to believe it was safe to say so." He pressed his forehead to hers. "It is safe," he said. Outside, the late winter light was going gold across the meadow snow, and the spruce trees were dark and still, and somewhere in the distance a hawk was calling across the open sky. They went back to town together in April, when the mud had settled enough for reliable travel, and the reception they received was precisely what he had expected and she had prepared herself for. Men who had known Luke Monroe for a decade looked at him differently. Women drew their children back. The deputy, Bolt, crossed the road to avoid being seen near them, which Luke privately considered an improvement on the alternative. There were moments that were harder than he let show. A crowd of farmhands outside the grain warehouse who called out things that were ugly enough that Luke turned his horse and rode toward them with a look on his face that was very quiet and very deliberate. And they backed off and dispersed with the quick, shame-faced shuffling of men who had said a thing in a group that they would not have said alone. Shagrol watched this from horseback with her chin up and her jaw set, and when the farmhands were gone she said nothing about it, just met his eyes with a look that said, "Thank you, and also, I can fight my own battles, and also, I am glad you are here." All three things at once, which was a look only she could produce. But there were also other moments. Old Farrell Hendricks shook Shagrol's hand and asked about the Northern Valley pelts and talked to them both for half an hour about the upcoming season's trade prospects, cheerfully indifferent to anyone who walked by and stared. The herbalist, a small, quick woman named Dara Voss who had been mixing medicines in Ridgefort for 30 years, asked Shagrol sharp, interested questions about the plant medicines used in the Eastern Clan territories, and invited her into the back of the shop to compare herb stocks. The blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of about 16 who had been watching with enormous eyes, finally sidled up and asked Shagrol about the throwing knife at her calf, which he had apparently been trying to study without being noticed for the better part of 20 minutes. The world, Luke was beginning to understand, was not entirely one thing. It was a great many different people making different choices about what to do with what they had been taught, and the ones who chose differently made all the difference. They made 3 more trips to Ridgefort that spring, each one a little easier than the last, partly because they were becoming a familiar sight and partly because Luke, with the quiet, patient authority of a man who has been respected in a community for a decade and intends to spend that respect on something worthwhile, simply made it so. He did not argue with people or demand their approval. He was simply present and steady and clearly not going to be moved, and over time people began to recalibrate. That summer, Shagrol brought her mother. Dura Strongtusk arrived in the meadow on a mountain pony that was slightly too small for her and enormously dignified about it. And she was nearly 60 and had a face like carved granite and eyes like her daughter's, bright and amber and missing nothing. She looked at Luke's cabin from the pony's back with the same methodical assessment he had seen Shagrol apply to everything, walked the perimeter of the property, came inside and looked at the fireplace and the root cellar and the loft, sat at the table, accepted the tea he made without comment, and then asked him 5 very direct and specific questions about his long-term plans for the property, his health, his finances, his relationship with his surviving brothers, and what he intended to offer her daughter. He answered everyone honestly. She listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she turned to Shagrol and said something in the clan tongue that was low and swift, and Shagrol went very still, and then something bloomed across her face that he had not seen before, something young and helpless and glad. "What did she say?" he asked. "She said you pass," Shagrol told him. "That is all. She also said you look at me the way my father used to look at her." A pause. "That is not a small thing." Dura Strongtusk stayed a week. She was excellent company and terrifying, and she taught him 3 things about root cellar management that immediately improved his winter store yield, which he suspected was her version of a blessing. He asked Shagrol to marry him in September, on an evening when the light was low and the meadow was full of elk, in exactly the way he had described to her on their first long ride, the big bulls moving through the gold-turning grass in the early dusk, their breath steaming, their antlers like dark trees against the sky. He had been keeping an eye on the elk sign for weeks, waiting for the evening when the conditions would be exactly right, and when they were he took her out to the porch and they stood together watching the herd move through the meadow, and he put his arm around her and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life doing this." She looked at him. "Standing on this porch," she said, with a hint of the laugh he had come to love like the sound of the fire. "Watching something real and beautiful and alive," he said, "with you." She turned from the elk to him, and the light was in her amber eyes, and she put her hand on his chest over his heart. "Yes," she said, "Luke Monroe, yes." They married in October, at the edge of the meadow with the spruce dark behind them, and the first snow of the season coming soft and light from a gray sky, small white flakes settling in Shagrol's black hair like stars. They did it twice, once in the way of Luke's people, with the words spoken by a traveling minister named Father Cates who made the high mountain circuit twice a year, and who recorded it in his book without comment or judgment, and shook Luke's hand and called Shagrol, "young woman," in the way of a man who had seen a great many things, and decided that kindness was more interesting than convention. And once in the way of Shagrol's clan, with Braca and Dura Strongtusk and 4 other clan members who had come down from the northern valleys for it, with spoken vows in the clan tongue, and the exchange of the bound cord that Dura had braided from red and black thread, and the small fire that was built in the snow and fed with pine and birch, and kept burning through the night by whoever felt moved to add wood, which was everyone. Luke stood in the snow with the bound cord on his wrist and his wife's hands in both of his and thought, "I am the luckiest man in any mountain range on either side of the divide." Braca gave a speech that went on for 20 minutes and made everyone cry, which no one had seen coming from Braca, and she maintained afterward that she had not cried at all, and everyone else was simply mistaken. They spent the winter together in the cabin for the first time properly as a household, and it was the best winter of Luke's life. Not because it was easy. The snows that year were deep, and the cold was serious, and they lost one trap line entirely to a fallen tree, and spent 2 days in weather that dropped below the worst he had seen digging it out. But because every hard day ended at the same fire with the same person, and there was a rightness to that made the difficulty matter less, and the warmth matter more. He learned the 1,000 details of her that you can only learn in proximity. The way she woke immediately and fully, no slow emergence for her, just sleep and then presence. The way she thought through problems out loud in long, careful sentences, working toward the answer rather than arriving at it. The way she hummed when she was reading, low and absent-minded. The way she could go very quiet when something had hurt her and needed to be asked, gently and directly, rather than left to resolve itself. He learned that she liked her tea strong and her meat lean, and her mornings quiet and her evenings full of conversation. He learned that she could outshoot him at 200 yards and had been being politely restrained about it since the first week. She learned him, too, in the same way. She learned that he was at his best with his hands busy, that he needed to fix things when he was anxious, that he would carry a problem silently for days before naming it, that the brass watch being wound every morning was the closest he had to a ritual, that he loved the elk but would not hunt them because he thought they deserved the meadow. She learned that he was, beneath the steady quietness, a man of deep and specific feeling, and that his love was not a loud thing, but it was constant and whole and shaped exactly to her, and she understood over the winter that she had not known. She needed something that patient and certain until she had it. The spring brought a problem. Word had gotten to Bolt, who had apparently spent the winter nursing his grievance into something official-looking. He appeared at the meadow with 2 militiamen, and a document that he claimed was a land use order requiring the property to be registered as a trading post if it was going to be used for commerce with non-human parties, which was not a real regulation and everyone present knew it, but documents have a weight to them regardless, and Bolt was banking on that. Luke came out onto the porch with his rifle across his arm, not raised, just present. "Deputy Bolt," he said, "you have come a long way up the mountain to show me a piece of paper." "This is a registered property use notice," Bolt said, holding up the document. He was trying to sound official and mostly succeeding. Under the Ridgefort Settlement Code, any private homestead used for regular non-human commercial transactions requires registration and a compliance fee. "I am a trapper," Luke said. "My wife is also a trapper. We sell furs together to registered markets. We are a family business. There is no provision in the Ridgefort Settlement Code requiring a compliance fee for a family business." "She is not," Bolt started. "She is my wife," Luke said, very quietly, very clearly. Shagrol had come out onto the porch behind him. She stood at his side, not behind him, not to the side but directly beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and she looked at Bolt and the 2 militiamen with an expression so composed and steady that it had its own kind of weight. One of the militiamen was young, barely 20, and he was looking at the document in Bolt's hand, and then at Luke and Shagrol, and then back at the document with the expression of someone who is beginning to have real doubts about the errand he has been sent on. "This document," Shagrol said, "is not stamped with the trading magistrate's seal. It has only the deputy constable's signature. That is insufficient authority for a property use notice under the Ridgefort Charter." She said it calmly, with the precision of someone who had done her research, and the document fluttered slightly in Bolt's hand. "How do you," he began. "I have been a registered trader in this district for 7 years, Shagrol said. "I know the charter." The young militiaman's doubts had apparently reached a conclusion. He stepped back one deliberate step out of the formation and looked at his boots. The other militiaman looked at Bolt. Bolt looked at the document, looked at Luke, looked at Shagrol. He had nothing. He had known he had nothing when he came, most likely. He had been hoping that the performance of authority would be enough. "This is not done," he said. "Yes, it is," Luke said, in the same quiet, certain tone he had used on the road into Ridgefort that first afternoon. "Good day, deputy." Bolt turned his horse and went back down the trail. The young militiaman looked up at Luke and Shagrol as he turned his horse, and he met their eyes for a moment, and then he nodded, a small, quick thing, barely visible, and rode after the others. When they were gone, Shagrol let out a long, slow breath. Luke looked at her. "Charter law," he said. "Braca is very well read," she said. "She made me study the Ridgefort Charter 2 winters ago when she suspected this sort of thing might come up eventually. I want to thank Braca extensively. She will be insufferable about it. I will thank her anyway." She turned and looked at him, and for a moment the composure was just slightly off, just slightly past the edge of what she kept perfectly controlled, and he saw what it had cost her, the steadiness, the precision, the holding of herself exactly right in the face of something designed to take from her. He opened his arms and she came into them without ceremony, without needing to make anything of it, and he held her and felt her exhale against his shoulder. "You do not have to do that alone," he said softly into her hair. "I know," she said. "I was not alone, you were beside me." "Always," he said. "That is the whole arrangement." She laughed, quiet and warm against his shoulder. They went back inside. That summer they made the trip north to the valley settlements for the first time together. Not the quick supply run that Shagrol had made alone, but a proper journey, the two of them with Rue and a pack horse, following the trail through the Blackthorn Pass and up into the high country that Shagrol had told him about in the winter evenings, the valley light and the aspen groves, and the way the elk moved through the open grass in the early morning. The high valleys were everything she had described. They were also home to something Luke had not fully let himself imagine, a functioning community of Orc clan members. 200 and some people living in the long, low structures that Shagrol had called clan houses, with gardens and workshops and children running between the buildings and old people sitting outside in the evening light talking, and smoke from cook fires and the smell of bread baking, and the general hum and noise of a community that was alive and working. They looked at him when he arrived. Of course they did. A human man on a gray horse riding in beside Shagrol Strongtusk was not a common sight, and there was a long, cautious moment of collective assessment that he felt across his whole body. Then Braca came out of the nearest building at a run and flung herself at Shagrol with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting a very long time, and grabbed Shagrol's face in both hands and told her she had taken too long and her hair was a mess and she had missed her enormously, all in the same breath, and then turned to Luke and pointed at him and said to the assembled community, "This is the one. He loaned the best horse," which apparently settled it. He spent 2 weeks in the valley. He helped repair 2 of the clan house roofs because the wood had gone soft in the previous winter's wet and needed replacing, and he knew how to work with timber. He sat in on the trading council session and contributed 3 suggestions that Shagrol later told him had been accepted unanimously, which she said was more than Braca had managed in 5 years of attending. He ate the clan food, which was good, most of it, and very heavily spiced, which he adapted to gradually, and drank the fermented grain drink that the older men offered him, which was extremely strong and which he drank with more bravery than he felt. He played the travel game, a strategy game played on a carved wooden board with Dura Strongtusk every evening after supper, and lost every single time without exception, and began to suspect that Dura was a genius. On the night before they left for the south, Shagrol's mother held a fire gathering for the community. Everyone came, all 200 and some people, sitting around a great fire that they built in the central clearing, and there was food and music and the exchange of stories that, Shagrol explained quietly to Luke, was the old ceremony for welcoming someone into the extended family of a clan. He sat beside her at the fire and understood what was happening, and felt it move through him like something enormous and quiet. One of the old men told a story in the clan tongue about a man from a far country who had come to the valley 100 years ago and learned the language and the trade and become one of them, not by forgetting where he came from, but by choosing where he was going. Shagrol translated it for him, very softly, sitting close so her mouth was near his ear, and when she was done, he looked at the fire and felt the kind of gratitude that does not fit in words. He took her hand in his. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed that way in the firelight with her family around them and the valley dark and enormous above, until the fire burned low. He went back to the southern cabin in the late summer and began an expansion. The cabin was right for one person, adequate for two, but he could see now what it needed to be. He spent the autumn adding a second room to the east side, a proper bedroom with a good wood floor, and widening the loft and strengthening its supports. Shagrol came and went between the cabin and the valley through the season, helping with the expansion work on her stays, and running the northern part of the trap line from the valley end when she was there. They were building a two-location life, a thing that fit both of them, and the work of it was as satisfying as the result. In the second spring of their marriage, Shagrol told him at the fire one evening with the careful straightforwardness she brought to everything, "I am going to have a child." The fire crackled. He looked at her. She looked back, watching his face with the patient readiness of someone who has prepared for a range of responses, as though she was not sure. As though there was a version of this where he might retreat from the enormousness of it. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "I am so glad," he said simply, and his voice did something on the last word that he had not planned, something that made her close her fingers over his very tightly and press her lips together for a moment. "So am I," she said, when she had herself again. "So am I." They had a son in November, during a snowstorm that came in fast and hard and had Luke building up the fire to its highest heat, and sitting with Shagrol through 12 hours of labor with his hand in hers and her grip, which could have broken his hand if she had not been so carefully controlled of herself even in extremity, squeezing hard enough to leave marks that lasted a week. Strongtusk arrived through the snow on the morning of the birth, having apparently been watching for the signs, and started riding south 4 days before it happened, with an equanimity about her own foresight that she did not explain and no one questioned. The boy was born at mid-morning, and he was large and loud and thoroughly real, with his mother's amber eyes and his father's brown hair, and a pair of small, perfect lower tusks already just beginning to show as tiny ivory points. And he put his face against Luke's chest when Luke first held him, and went still with the perfect trust of a new thing that knows it is safe. They named him Darren, after Shagrol's father, who had died before she could bring Luke north to meet him, and they gave him Monroe as his family name and Strongtusk as his clan name, because he was both things, and both things were good. Braca arrived 3 days after the birth, announced only by Rue's familiar canter on the meadow trail, and she came through the door and looked at the baby in Shagrol's arms and went very quiet in a way that was entirely unlike her. "Hello," she said to Darren, in the smallest voice Luke had ever heard from her. Darren looked at her with his amber eyes and grabbed her extended finger with a grip that made Braca gasp. "He is strong," Braca said. "Of course he is," Shagrol said, with the absolute certainty of a mother. Braca stayed 2 weeks and did not make a single speech. She was too busy holding the baby. The years that followed were full. Luke expanded the trap line into a proper trading operation over 3 seasons, bringing in a partner, a human man named Cal Brennan from the western side of the range, who had been trading with orc clans for years, and had the roots and the contacts, and eventually establishing a reliable circuit that ran pelts from both the southern and northern ranges to the valley markets and the southern trading posts. Shagrol ran the northern end of the operation with a precision and tenacity that made it consistently the most productive section, and she developed a reputation among the traders on the high circuit as someone whose word, once given, was good unto death, and whose quality assessments were better than any other assessors in the territory. Deputy Bolt was removed from his position 3 years after the property use notice incident, not by any action of Luke or Shagrol's, but by the trading magistrate, who conducted a review of the previous 5 years of militia activities and found 19 separate instances of actions taken against registered traders without warrant or cause, the majority of which had been against orc traders. He was replaced by a young woman named Petra Marsh, who had grown up on a borderland homestead and had a different set of lessons in her bones about what the world owed different people. And she and Shagrol eventually became something that might be called friends, in the way that two people with similar standards and a mutual respect can build something functional and warm from those two things. Old Farrell Hendricks retired and left his storehouse to his nephew, who turned out to be fair and sharp-minded, and who expanded the storehouse into a proper exchange that did more business with the Northern Valley clans than any other establishment in Ridgefort, and made a considerable living from it, and whose success made a quieter argument than anything Luke or Shagrol could have made out loud. Bracca came south and found a post in the trading office and was insufferable and essential in equal measure, and everyone knew it, and she married a human cartographer named Sted Verrier, who had been mapping the northern passes for the Valley Development Council, and who was one of the most patient men Luke had ever met, which he suspected was not a coincidence. Dara Voss, the herbalist, corresponded with Shagrol for years about plant medicine exchange and eventually published a small book, the first of its kind, a comparative study of human frontier herbalism and Eastern Orc clan medicinal practice, that she dedicated in part to Shagrol Strongtusk Monroe, whose knowledge and generosity made this work possible. Darren grew into himself steadily, the way good things do. He had his mother's eyes and his father's patient steadiness, and his grandmother Dura's strategic mind and Aunt Bracca's sharp tongue. And he was a child who moved easily between the southern cabin and the northern valley, and seemed to understand without being told that he was the inheritor of two traditions, and that this was not a burden but a gift, and that the road between those traditions had been built at some cost, and should be honored by walking it with care. When Darren was 5, Shagrol told Luke at the same fire, in the same careful way, that there was going to be a second child. This time he did not look to read her face for the range of what he might do. He just stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his face into her hair. "Good," he said. The second child was a girl, born in spring, when the meadow was just beginning to green, and the first flowers were coming up through the last of the snow, and they named her Myra, which was a name from Luke's mother's people. His mother had been from a valley town to the east and had carried certain words and names from there, and Myra came into the world quiet and watchful and wide-eyed, and grew into someone who noticed everything, which her family eventually learned to take as fair warning. When Myra was a year old, Dura Strongtusk made the trip south for the last time. She was 67, and the journey was hard on her, but she made it with the same granite dignity she brought to everything, and she sat at the table in the expanded cabin and held her granddaughter and played Darren at the carved board game, which he was already starting to beat her at, which she accepted with the only visible pride she ever showed. She sat with Luke one evening when Shagrol had gone to put the children to sleep, and she looked at him across the table for a long time without speaking. "You have been good to her," Dura said at last. "She has been good to me," he said honestly. "More than I can account for." Dura was quiet. Then, "My husband used to say that love was not a feeling but a practice, that you chose it every day or you did not, and that the choosing was the thing." She looked at him steadily. "You have practiced well." He did not know what to say to that. He said, "Thank you, Dura." She nodded once and went back to looking at the fire, and they sat in a companionable silence that asked nothing of either of them. She went back to the northern valley the following week. She passed the winter after that quietly in the clan house with her people around her, and died in the early spring in her sleep, which everyone who knew her agreed was fitting. Dura Strongtusk would not have approved of any kind of dramatic exit, and she would not have approved of leaving on any kind of cold, difficult day if she could help it. Shagrol received the word by Ryder in late March. She sat with it quietly for a long time. Luke stayed close, not filling the silence, not trying to manage her through it, just present and warm and available. At some point in the evening she said, "She approved of you." "I know," he said. "She was very selective." "I know." She looked at him and her eyes were bright and full, and she did not try to manage that either. "She said you looked at me the way my father looked at her," she said. "That first time, she said it was the first thing she assessed." "What did she see?" he asked softly. "She said you looked at me as though I was the center of the room," Shagrol said. "Not a point of danger, not a curiosity, the center." He reached across and took her hand. "You are," he said, "every room I have ever been in with you." She pressed his hand against her face and held it there, and he felt the warmth of her tears against his palm, and he stayed still and let her take what she needed from the contact, and did not move. They went north in the summer to help settle Dura's things and be present for the clan morning ceremony, and Luke stood at the fire in the valley clearing again, this time in grief rather than celebration, and he understood again what it was to belong to something. That belonging was not only the celebration but also the grief, the showing up for the whole of it, the staying. Darren, who was 7, sat very straight and very still at the fire with the particular gravity of a child who understands something true about what is happening and intends to honor it. Myra, at 2, slept in Luke's arms through most of it, her small warm weight a kind of anchor. The years settled into the long, particular happiness of a life that has been chosen deliberately and tended carefully. The operation grew. The cabin on the meadow became a household with a vegetable garden and 2 milk goats, and a second linta for storing the expanded equipment. The trail to Ridgefort became familiar enough that Darren could ride it alone when he was 9 and come back with the supplies on a list. The Northern Valley trade route became one of the most reliable circuits in the high country, and its reputation for fair dealing and quality product drew other traders and other homesteaders who were interested in the same cross-community commerce. And slowly, in the way that water changes stone, not visibly, not dramatically, but inevitably, the shape of things shifted. Not all the way, not into some peaceable perfection that scrubbed out the hard history. That was not how the world worked, and neither of them were naive enough to think it was. There were still men like Bolt in every settlement, men who had decided that the old stories were the only ones worth knowing, and there would be. But there were also more people choosing differently. More hands extended across the line that the border wars had drawn, more voices in the trading councils and the magistrates' offices that knew the economics of cooperation, and had decided that the economics mattered more than the old grudges. Small shifts, real ones. Darren grew into a young man who spoke common, and the clan tongue with equal ease, and who, when the Valley Development Council began work on a formal trade charter that would govern commerce between human settlements and orc communities in the High Territory, was asked to serve as a junior delegate because of his particular fluency in both languages and both sets of customs. Which meant that, by the time he was 20, he was doing the work that his parents had done simply, by existing, building the road by walking it. The night before Darren left for the Valley Council seat, Luke and Shagrol sat on the porch of the cabin in the last of the autumn warmth, watching the meadow in the evening light. The elk were not there that night, but the meadow was full of the long gold grass and the dark tree line, and the sky going from blue to rose to the deep indigo of coming dark, and it was beautiful in the specific way of things that are real and earned and yours. Luke had the brass watch open in his hand. He wound it, as he did every morning and every evening, with the small key his father had kept on a cord at his neck for 30 years, which he now kept on the same cord at his own neck. Shagrol watched him wind it as she had watched him wind it 1,000 times. "Do you remember," she said, "that first night?" "Every detail," he said. "You gave me half the fire," she said. "I had nothing and you had very little and you gave me half of it. And you gave me half your watch," he said. That was the real thing. She looked at him. You trusted me enough to sleep, he said. In the dark, on the ground, with a stranger. You took half the watch and let me sleep, and that was how I knew. Knew what? That something was going to happen, he said, between us. I did not know what or how, but I knew. She was quiet, looking at the meadow. Then she took the watch from his hand very gently and held it. I knew before that, she said. I knew when you fired the rifle into the air rather than at the wolves first. A man who fires a warning shot first is a man who is trying not to be afraid. I was afraid, he said. I just did not want to be. That is the best kind of bravery, she said. The kind that knows what it is and does the thing anyway. He looked at her in the evening light, his wife, in the leather bodice and the rust-colored blouse that she still wore, though both had been mended so many times that the original was more memory than material. Her black hair threaded now with the first silver at the temples, the amber eyes as clear and present as they had ever been, the tusks as elegantly curved. She was 41, and she was more beautiful than the night he had found her in the clearing, which he had not thought possible. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, the way she had learned to let herself do, not collapsing, never that, but the specific ease of someone who has learned over many years that they are held and does not need to hold themselves quite so fiercely every moment. We have done something, she said quietly, have we not? We have, he agreed, something that will last longer than us. Darren carries it, he said, and Myra, and everyone who does business on that circuit because we made it reliable. He paused. An old Hendricks nephew who built his whole trade on the northern clans, and Bracca's charts of the pass routes, and Dara Voss's medicine book. He paused again. Things compound. It was quiet, but he could feel the satisfaction in her, the deep, real, particular satisfaction of a person who has built something that matters. You know what I think about sometimes, she said. Tell me. I think about if you had kept riding, she said. That night, if you had heard the wolves and thought not my business, not my trail, and kept south. He shook his head slowly. I could not have, he said, not with someone still fighting. You did not know I was still fighting. The hiss, he said. And the branch hitting stone. You were still fighting. I could not have kept riding. She turned and looked at him. No, she said. I do not think you could have. He kissed her, there on the porch with the meadow darkening and the first stars coming out above the tree line, with 16 years of their life behind them and whatever was still ahead of them still to be lived. And she kissed him back with the same fullness she had brought to it the first time when she had crossed the cabin floor and taken his face in her hands and decided. When they drew back, she held the watch out to him. He took it, and held it a moment, and then held it out to her. She looked at it. Then at him. Your watch, he said. She closed her fingers around it. Inside, through the cabin window, the fire was burning steady and warm, and the cabin was full of the things that accumulate in a life that has been lived in one place with good intention, mended harness and dried herbs, and a carved wooden board game, and a child's first boot by the door, and a book with pressed flowers between its pages and 2 pair of working gloves hanging on the same peg, and the smell of pine smoke and good food, and something that was just life, ordinary and irreplaceable. Shagrol looked at the watch in her hand. She looked at Luke. She smiled, which was still, after all of it, the thing that undid him the most completely, the way it changed her whole face and reached all the way to her amber eyes and made the world seem suddenly more generous than it usually managed. Half my watch, she said. Half my fire, he said. The stars were coming fully out over the meadow now, bright and cold and many, and the night was coming and the fire was good and they were there together and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything.